Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you back to my ongoing podcast series around leadership. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Rachel King. And before we get Rachel on the line, I'd just like to do a bit of a background to her before we get the conversation started. So, Rachel is currently the Executive Officer of the Australian Council of Prawn Fisheries. She was working for in the same capacity as an executive officer for Oysters Australia. She has worked on country of origin labelling with the Northern Territory Seafood Council. He's also worked as part of the oyster industry with the New South Wales Farmers Association, has worked at GrainCorp, and has also worked for Australian Plus. Have I got that right?
Auctions Plus they are now. Yeah.
Plus, sorry.
Meat and livestock.
Yes, very good. So welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you, Eric, for having me.
Mate, it's fantastic to catch up. And so the just to trigger some going back a little bit for the listeners, that the podcast is around leadership, and I have had the pleasure of working with Rachel at level being an executive officer, as well as her working as the EO for ACPF, at which time I am a director, and she does a fantastic job and is a far better leader than I will ever be. Hence the time I'd like to take to have the chat to you about your leadership journey. So I'll start with the question I've started with everyone, is in that can you tell us in which industry you had your first leadership role, and why did you take that leadership role on?
I think the first leadership role didn't necessarily have the title of leader. It was a task that was allocated to me. I was given responsibility in the trading office of GrainCorp at the time, to assist them to be GST ready. So this is heading into the year 2000. I'm pretty sure that's right, when we're all panicking about being GST ready. So this was a startup division of GrainCorp, and I use this example because the person who I was reporting to, I was quite astonished. He took me out of the role that I was in, gave me quite a bit of responsibility to ready the section for the GST, but in doing so, he took a risk. He did put me through some training so that I could get across the IT side of things, and there was some funky maths involved. But yeah, he gave me that lead role and the responsibility. And yeah, I look back at that time with gratitude, I guess.
Wow. So the journey that you started was one of opportunity from another leader taking a risk and saying, "Hey, come and help us with this." It's a good place to start, because in a lot of the podcasts that I've talked to, people have moved in through either family businesses or they've started their own business, and how we get to where we get to a leadership role can vary significantly between people. So in that sense, when you use the terminology that he took a risk, or someone's taken a risk in someone else's path to give them an opportunity to be a leader, in your experience, have you seen a big difference, if any, or a difference between leadership and management in the context of your leadership experience?
Yeah, and I'll tackle that in a second, if that's okay, because I think just one thing I didn't touch on in that first scenario is that it was a requested thing. I've always been a reluctant starter, so I know that's something that some others talk about, that sometimes there's a fear of what on earth does that look like that I'm being asked to do. So yeah, I would describe myself as a reluctant leader in some senses. So just getting to the question of is there a difference between leadership and management? Um, if I can use an analogy about some people that I manage, they're not colleagues or peers, but I use them because it paints the picture of the difference between management and leadership, and
Sure.
they're my kids. So it's a bit of a different setting. So I can manage them to bed. I can use a well applied spatula in various parts of their body, or I can remove devices on the weekend. But that's very different to leading a group of people. Leading the people, I think, is about, I'll go with you on this journey that we're on. I'll encourage you to do what it takes. I encourage you to take risks, and I'll be with you in that process. So, I'm still trying to work that out with my kids, and they're not my colleagues or peers. But you get what I'm trying to say. I think management is a very different approach to leadership, which implies that you're going on a journey with the people and assisting them.
Yeah, that's and thank you for sharing that. That's I've never heard it couched quite like that. That leadership is a process that you take other people on, and then it speaks to all those things around how do you motivate people to come along with you, what's the goals that you're setting, and how do you encourage people to come along? Because I guess in the most very basic sense of things, and this is some of what I'm learning from the people that I'm interviewing, is that you've got to set a goal. You're heading to some end point, and if you can't bring the people with you, then you're not really leading anything. It's not leadership; it's something else. So, in that vein, and because all journeys have an occasional hiccup, can you give me some of your experience around the following? So, leaders make mistakes. How do you own an error or mistake that's attributed to your leadership, Rachel?
Yeah, I think this is very individual to the person, because everyone works with errors in a different way. Some people, it just rolls off. Some people it doesn't, and it sits with them for a very long time. This is something that I've needed to work on considerably. So for the first thing for me is to understand that, on balance, I try to remember that I've done a generally good job. But in terms of errors or mistakes, it's important to understand that they're things that you can learn from. So the first thing is to own it, and to learn from it, and then to figure out how you can tackle it differently next time. Because if you can't learn, then, I guess you'd ask the question, can you lead?
Yeah, okay. So one of the bits of feedback around this owning a mistake is that it provides, instead of being a negative, it provides an opportunity to learn. Have you found that in your travels? Not just so going broadly than your experience from what you've seen of other leaders. Do you think other leaders have taken those mistakes or errors and used them as an opportunity to learn or grow from that error?
It's hard to say. I mean, I don't want to judge others, but I think there can be an element of maybe in corporate culture of buck passing. And I think
Okay.
in a buck passing culture, there's not the mindset of owning something, of acknowledging what you've contributed to a situation. And if you can't own it, you can't assess it, you can't learn from it, and then you can't do it differently next time. So, if it's always
Nice.
everybody
That's a
else's
nice way to
fault,
unpack that. That's a nice way to unpack that. Thank you for bringing that up, because one thing that hasn't really come up in the discussions, and not that this is a factor in anything when we're trying to talk about leadership, I guess, at an individual level, is that to what extent is the industry and the context in which you work shape the kind of leader that you are? So I'm guessing from a corporate sector perspective, owning mistakes can be a lot more difficult because of the potential it might have for your work, whereas maybe there's differences in other sectors, like, for example, the not-for-profit or other sectors that aren't sort of corporate, have a corporate focus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that there's probably even difference within that though. So it really does depend on the mindset and the psyche of the organisation. If the organisation is one that supports its people and allows them to take risks, and then lets them assess and own where they've gotten to, then that's a very different organisation to ones I've observed, as a third party, where every mistake is recorded, and it's that yes, KPIs are important, but you're only as good as your last mistake, sort of thing. So and yeah, watching from the outside sometimes in the big corporates, sometimes it can head in that direction, and the person then freezes, and then he's always on the defence, and is not. You don't get the best out of that person.
Sure.
Yeah.
So can I ask in this vein about mistakes and sort of what you might call a negative part of the leadership process is what's the most difficult part for you about being a leader in your experience?
The most difficult part is understanding, and I think this applies for a lot of people, understanding where you're at in the development of leadership skills. So, there is quite a continuum, and assessing where you're at on that spectrum, I think is the first step. It's not just about, managing other people or leading others. I think you need to understand where you're at first, and also to continually assess that through the process of leading.
Do you mean self-reflection?
Yeah, I guess so. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So something more positive then. How do you measure success as a leader?
How do I measure success? I think by the growth of the people and the industry that I work with. So it's not about a change in position, title. It's I think it's about the success of other people. So, and I think that harks back to an earlier question that I think you're interested in as well, is what is an effective leader? And I think it's not about you. So it's not about scoring approval brownie points. It's about other people, and it's about helping them reach their potential. So so I think that's how I would measure success as a leader.
Okay, so the next phase of questions that I'm asking really revolves around not so much questions. It's statements. So I've got 3 here for you to consider, and I'd love to get your perspective on. On the job, experience develops better leaders.
I think it can, but it can also make or break. So say, just hark back to the corporate example, and I've never, I guess, worked in the environment that I was talking about before. It's just an observation. So someone can be crushed in that environment, and so any leadership potential might not be grown. On the flip side, someone can be mentored and become a great leader themselves. So yes, on the job experience can develop better leaders. It can also be tricky.
Okay, great. Can I ask you the next, get your views on the next question, the next statement? formal education helps to develop better leaders?
Yeah, so I'd actually put the NSILP in the category of formal education, which we've both done, and we wear our
And
badges
for the
pride.
benefit of the listeners, the NSLIP is the National Seafood Industry Leadership Program. That is quite an excellent program that is led by Jill Briggs and Chris Calageris through the Effectus organisation, and I'll put up a link to them on the podcast. So yeah, sorry, I'm just when people talk and they use acronyms, I try and spell them out for the listeners who may not know what INSILP is. But yeah, go on, mate. Sorry for interrupting.
That's fine. No, that's a great program, and one in which I think that was my first formal, I call it formal leadership education.
Same.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So I think formal education like that, it gives you the theory behind some of the approaches, and it gives you, I'm going to use the word fodder, in which to try on, in live examples. So otherwise, I think we're in danger of operating in a vacuum when we're, trying to figure out ways in which to lead.
Okay, so here's the more vexing one, and this everyone that's answered this question has been interesting. So I know we're going to have something to talk about here. Leaders are born, not made.
I think yes and no. Yes and no.
Yes,
So
yes and no. Yes and no.
yes
Okay.
and no.
Thanks,
Yes and
everyone.
no.
That's the end of the podcast. It's yes and no. Yeah,
That's
go
fine.
on. Go on. Sorry.
Sure. No, that's fine. I think yes, someone is born with a certain set of traits that can be attributed to leadership, and those are often confidence, decisiveness. I think definitely emotional intelligence is required, and a degree of selflessness. So someone can be born with those traits. Without those traits, I think it's a harder road to lead and to leadership. But the no is that someone can be born with a different skill set and different genetic makeup, but they can learn those skills. So if someone is willing to learn, and if someone is willing to step outside of their comfort zone, they can learn the skills needed. And I think that's I guess there's a message in that for me as well, that there's no point of ever having arrived in leadership. Leadership is a constant learning opportunity, and we never stop learning and trying on new things.
That's an interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that. So here's the bit in the podcast where I'm going to ask for perspectives, not for agreement or disagreement, just more your perspective. So from the studies that I'm undertaking in leadership, I'm looking at what are the key or core capabilities that future leaders will need, and I'm looking at, in particular, strategic thinking and foresight. Can I get your views on what you might deem to be those core leadership skills going forward?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my answer to this is another one of your questions, is strategic thinking and foresight the most critical leadership capability for future leaders? And my answer to that is yes and no.
Right.
Again.
Okay, sure.
Sorry. So I think, yes, strategic thinking and foresight is a skill that is essential for a leader, because if you're leading people, then obviously it helps to know where you're going. Otherwise, you might end up happily all walking off a cliff together.
Sure.
But on the flip side, there are people with the incredible skill of strategic and big picture thinking and foresight who aren't natural leaders. So I think that's another, yes or no, yes and no question.
No, and that's okay. And again, I asked this not in the context of getting agreement, although that part of me wishes that everyone might see that in the same way. But jokes aside, for me, it's part of the program of studies that I'm looking at. And if I've learnt one thing from these conversations is that there are other core capabilities that link into these two. They just happen to be the ones that I'm focusing on. So yeah, and they will part of this will form future discussions I'm going to have with people, and hopefully coming back to yourself to discuss some issues around what these capabilities look like for fit for future leadership in the ag sector, and more particularly around having the discussion and debate, which will be for another time. But again, I'd love to get you involved on a podcast in this capacity, is around how can you develop those capabilities in people to maximize the benefit of leadership for either a business or an industry sector, or because there's a lot of investment in Australia, let alone globally, in developing leaders, and that investment has to have some kind of the return on investment thing that people that talk about. Now, I'm not talking pure dollar return on investment returns back to businesses, because it's more than that. Return on investment can be how long does a person stay in that industry sector, and that leadership then has a benefit beyond the organisation that's paying for it. But I guess if you're a business person, you're investing in, let's say you work for me and I'm prepared to fund some courses for you, and suddenly the next day, as soon as you finish the course, you move on and go to some other employer, then it's fantastic that there's some altruism there, but people invest in other people so that they can get a return for their organisation, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's just part of the work life that we all have, but there's some bigger discussions to be had. And so my final question for you, Rachel, for this podcast is around if you could go back to a younger version of yourself, what would you say to a younger version of Rachel to really say these are the things you need to do to be an effective leader, if you could talk to a younger version of yourself?
Yeah, sure. I think I alluded to it earlier. It's not about you. So it's not about, approval or any brownie points that you might get from standing up and being counted. It's about other people. So, and if you need help to understand what that looks like for you, don't be afraid to go get it. So that's what I would say.
Fantastic. So for the listeners, this was Talking Leadership, and I'd like to thank again, Rachel, your time today in helping us talk through and navigate this thing called leadership, and I hope I can get you back on some future podcasts, mate.
And Eric, thank you for your leadership. It's appreciated.
Thanks very much, mate. So for those listening, thanks again, and I will catch you all on the next podcast.
Thanks.